It's 2023, and with democracy on its last legs, I figure we ought to take a closer look at the thing while we still can. We have already covered the why of democracy, now it is time to look at the how. Last year, we concluded that its purpose is to distill the will of the majority into an actionable moral standard. That's a nice idea, but without a way to connect individual preferences to a collective decision, it is basically meaningless. That is no small task. Many have tried to crack the code, and in the process have created a huge number of processes that are as useful as they are used. Haters will say it can't be done, but today, I'll be finding the perfect voting system. At its simplest, voting is about choices. In reality, these choices are usually tied up in candidates that each have their own set of indeterminate policy preferences, but theory is only helpful insofar as it can be practically applied, so we will focus on finding the best way to decide between a number of options. The simplest meaningful choice is a binary one, sparkling or still. Here, the ideal process is pretty straightforward. The option with the most votes wins. Like ending an email with thanks, this is the best way to do things because all the others are worse. When we are deciding between two options, either one wins or the other does. Different decision-making thresholds do nothing except give power to a smaller subset of the population. 50 plus 1 really is the best we can do. Like fitting kids inside a sedan, things get hard when we get to 3 or more. More than 2 options can disrupt an election through vote splitting, where similar options compete for the same voters, reducing their chances of winning and increasing the chance that an opposing option wins. As you might imagine, this is not good, and it caused the Iraq War. One way we can address this problem is by reducing a multi-way race into multiple head-to-head competitions. For example, if the options on tax policy are to tax the wealthy at 24%, 25%, 26%, or eat them, it is entirely plausible that we would finally reach the pinnacle of consumer capitalism and consume Bernard Arnault himself. But if we place these options head-to-head, we would have a clear winner, a 26% top marginal tax rate. When this happens, we have what is called a Condorcet winner, named for French mathematician and traitor to the Revolution, Marie-Jean-Antoine Nicolas de Cariat, Marquis de Condorcet. Many people think of beating all the other options as the gold standard for winning. Perhaps this seems reasonable to you, but there are 2 problems with using Condorcet methods to decide a winner. The first is something called the Condorcet Paradox, which states that preferences are not always transitive. The consequence of this is that sometimes there is no single Condorcet winner. Instead, there can be a group of candidates that are somehow not called a Condorcet, where each candidate in the set beats all competitors outside of it, but is involved in some sort of winning cycle with the other members of the set. There are a couple fancy voting systems that choose one of the candidates in the set to be the winner, but they still face the other fundamental issue with the Condorcet method: Gary Johnson. You see, it is entirely possible, if not likely, that a minor candidate that is either between the main candidates or less hated than them will win all their head-to-head matchups, even if they would get trounced overall. This motivates why many people prefer to seek some sort of balance between the flawed extremes of plurality voting, where the candidate the most liked the most wins, and approval voting, where the most liked candidate wins. Probably the most popular of these voting systems is instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting. In instant runoff voting, which is actually used in some states, voters rank candidates, and if no one has the majority, the one with the least first choice supporters is eliminated, and those ballots go to the second choice candidates. The process is repeated until someone has a majority. This system is good because it is pretty much the only real system where voters don't harm their preferred candidate by ranking another candidate below them, preventing most of the spoiler effect and discouraging tactical voting. Still, there are real issues with instant runoff voting, as we saw last year in Alaska, a state which recently adopted the process. In the special election to replace octogenarian Don Young, Democrat Mary Peltola narrowly defeated Republicans Nick Begich III, the red sheep of an Alaskan political dynasty, and Sarah Palin, a peddler of birtherism conspiracies who probably pretended to have a baby. Third-place finisher Begich was knocked out and transferred just enough votes to Peltola to give her a 51% majority. Had Palin placed third instead of Begich, the Republican would have won handedly, likely winning almost 60% of the vote. Begich was the Condorcet winner in this election, and he probably should have won in a fair system. So should we use approval voting then? But what about Gary? Is there any system that can produce the obviously correct result in both these situations? Well, yeah, but there would be some other circumstance that trips that one up. What is the perfect voting system? This question consumed me. Surely I could figure it out. If I couldn't, who could? But the answer escaped me. Frustration. What would be my contribution? My legacy? Anger. I became angry with myself, with the past. All the easy claims seemed to have been made. Surely I could have figured them out given the chance. I've played rock, paper, scissors. Doubt. I began to question if it were even possible. Was this all for nothing? For weeks, I was in shambles. Looking in the mirror, I saw a stranger. The question had changed me. Fear. I needed to escape. So I left it all behind. I got in touch with nature, in touch with peace. And in that tranquility, I found myself. And I found the answer. But I'm being redundant. Isn't it obvious? Okay. Hear me out. We can go around in circles, trying to design a system that reliably outputs the best result, but there will always be some situation where it gives us an answer that we can plainly see is wrong. Why search for a system that can pass all the tests we set up for it, when we can just make a system from the tests themselves? If I get to choose, any circumstance, no matter how tricky, will result in the result that a reasonable person, me, would expect. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying that I would choose whomever I want, or whomever I deem best or most deserving, to be the winner. That would be dictatorship, something that is incompatible with democratic theory. Instead, what would happen is I would receive the ballots, look through them, and decide the winner. Like in most systems, the ballot would allow voters to rank their preferences, and the results would be anonymized before I get them to assure you that there is no bias on my part. We can even throw in a couple dummy results to assuage any remaining reservations. If there are still concerns about public confidence, I can just be absorbed into the deep state or call myself the Electoral College. Needless to say, I would not be choosing the winners arbitrarily. I could go into the methods and metrics that I would look to in making a decision, but we needn't fall back into the trap of trying to make formal rules for deciding the winner of an election. The whole appeal of the system is that it is holistic, not boxed within the rigid confines of insensate protocol. I suspect you have two questions. First, why would I, of all people, be the one who decides the results? And second, what happens on August 18th, 2074, when I slip on a banana peel, hit my head on an electric scooter, and succumb to my wounds at Ascension Burgess Hospital 2 days thereafter, surrounded by friends and family? These questions have the same answer. Isn't it obvious? Okay, hear me out. We can go around in circles, trying to design a system that decides who gets to choose, but there will always be some problems with elections, especially for such an important position. Why search for a system that can somehow find a satisfactory person when we can just make a system? Let me choose. Okay, fine. I'll admit that there may be some problems with this idea. Reasonable people can disagree, and I'll freely admit that there are cases where people would understandably have issues with the conclusions I come to. But if we're going to base an election system on a defined process, accepting its inherent flaws, we need to do it right. People usually judge voting systems with a number of intuitive criteria in order to find a mathematically ideal solution. Approval voting is probably the most widely supported election system by so-called social choice theorists, despite failing one of the most basic standards, the majority criterion, which says that if someone is preferred by a simple majority of the population, they should win. Some theorists turn to Copeland's method, a Condorcet method, for a system that abides by the majority criterion, but Copeland's method fails to pass a different test, the later no harm criterion, which states that voters should not harm a preferred candidate by ranking another option below them. As mentioned previously, instant runoff voting meets both this standard and the majority criterion. However, it surprisingly fails to pass another pretty intuitive standard, the participation criterion, meaning that with IRV it is possible to hurt your preferred candidates by voting for them. And like Parker McCullum by the end of Gold Chain Cowboy, you'll be wishing that you never loved them at all. Where does that leave us? Are there any systems that fulfill the majority, later no harm, and the participation criteria? Turns out there is one, and only one, method that meets all three of these standards. And that finely crafted work of mathematical genius is none other than, drumroll please, first past the post. That's right, the answer has been right in front of us the whole time. Isn't that romantic? Yeah, as much as I'd like this video to conclude plurality voting is good, actually, there are, of course, many important standards it fails. Most worryingly, it fails the Condorcet loser criterion, meaning that in a plurality vote, a candidate can win even if they would have lost to every other candidate individually. What now? Every proposed system has some pretty significant flaws, and there's no clear reason to prioritize one metric over another. Is there anything more we can do than just arbitrarily choose our favorite? Fine. I'll do it myself.